Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith.
So, Matt, we did a walk down Front Street a couple months ago.
Yeah, we did.
And we ended here at Mokena and Front Street. And we thought
we did.
It'd be fun to finish our tour.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
kind of start back where we finished off.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Let's talk a little bit about the building here.
Yeah.
And we can cross the street as we
sure.
go. And this building, as we know from the episode we did on it, was built shortly after the Civil War.
Yeah, this building here in the corner was built in 1868, so that's only 3 years after the Civil War ended.
And it was built for what purpose?
It was a drugstore when it first
Initially.
opened. It was built by a man named Moritz Weiss, who was a German-born pharmacist. I'm going to get out of traffic here.
Yeah, good idea.
Got all his schooling in his homeland before he immigrated to America I believe that he showed up around the early 1850s or so and pretty much came straight here to Mokena, which was a brand new, freshly born little farm or farm/railroad settlement at the time. And
would we have seen any other buildings that still remain at that time when it was built?
When this building was built, let's see, I'm trying to kind of figure out, the building down just next to where Mokena Sales used to be, the yellow building, that was possibly there.
Okay.
That is a very, very old building, but it's kind of tough telling when exactly it was built, but I'd venture to say that was probably there when Moritz Weiss built his house here. And the northern half of the former Wanamaker building, now about to be the dock, that would have been in Mokena at the time.
Okay, so not too many buildings left over from when this property was built.
Not really. Laura Teal's would have probably been there. Yeah.
And it was a pharmacy. Do you know, was it kind of main front door through to the pharmacy? There's kind of a side building there.
Yeah. Where the front door is nowadays was where the front door to the business was. But it's interesting because this building was remodeled pretty extensively right after World War II ended, when it was converted over into being completely residential. And before it got remodeled, it had really big windows that would allow you to see in from the street.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it had big front windows where you could see right in from the street. There would have been sort of like a wooden awning that came off the top. But when it got converted over into residential, they kind of, made things a little smaller and, so on and so forth.
And the business, as far as you know, was that side part to the right part of the business?
Yeah, that's a good question. That I'm not sure of.
Okay.
I would guess it was probably residential, based on a really old picture of this building I've seen from around the 1890s, or maybe even about 1900 or so. It looked residential at that point.
So we stand here now. This is one we talked a little bit about, and we have a new business. Looks like that's opening up here, Hustle and Heart. But
yeah, right.
This is a building you said is a lot older than it looks, right?
Yeah, it is. And there's actually tons of history just on this corner. This is at least the third building to have stood here. But yeah, this building is much older than it looks like. The underneath of this kind of clapboard siding here are the original brick walls of this building as it was built, once again, not too terribly long after World War II ended. Around 1948 or 47, thereabouts.
Wow.
Looked, completely different. Underneath this is a solid brick building, and this little, whatever you want to call it, above the doorway here and that window up there, those were all additions when the building got this look in the early 2000s. But this building was originally a drugstore. was operated by Mr. Cavett, who I believe he was from Tinley Park originally, but he wasn't on the scene too terribly long because right around 1950-ish, or maybe even a tad before then, if I'm remembering right, the Bowman family moved in. And a lot of people in town will still remember them because they ran another drugstore right here. Hey, Melissa.
Hey, Melissa.
Hi. How's it going? They ran a drugstore here for all the way well into the 50s, up until the end of the 1950s. And their drugstore was one like you would have found in 1950s America. Like, aside from it being a place where, you know, you would get your prescription filled, they also had like a little soda fountain and tables. And actually, one of the very first phone booths in Mokena, public phone booths, was in the Bowman Pharmacy. Although the very, very first was across the street.
Now, these weren't pharmacies at the same time, right?
No. Yeah, there was quite a long gap in between the two.
And do you remember when the last time that this was a business?
Let's see. It did sit empty for a while. Just off the top of my head, without consulting any of the files or anything, one of the last businesses in this building would have been the confectionery, as it were, slash pool hall of Willard Marty and Gus Brown, who eventually moved across the street where the bank parking lot is now.
Okay.
That would have been like late 20s, early 30s. And there could very well have been something in there after them, but if there was, I've never found any record of it.
Well, when they listed it for sale a couple years ago, I know they said that it could still be a commercial use.
Oh,
so,
interesting. That'd be interesting to see if that ever happens.
Yeah. And so it's been a pharmacy, post office.
Yep.
Anything else?
There was a doctor back in the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, Dr. Becker. Had his office here. He was we could talk forever about him. He was a really interesting guy, Civil War veteran. He had his office here. But yeah, aside from drugstore, post office, kind of like candy shop slash pool hall, nothing's coming to mind.
Okay.
Although I'm sure that does not mean that, you know, that's the end all be all, but nothing's springing to mind without thinking about
let's keep moving a little bit. This intersection in this area really was, I mean, this is the major center for downtown at one point, right? So
yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
I mean, across the street, and again, we talked about this in the other one, but where the bank is now, you know, was the general store, and the other bank sat next to it. So you've got pharmacies and banks and bars, you know, taverns, everything to kind of make the town go. And this is kind of the center of it here. So
yeah, absolutely.
Obviously, the world famous Little Al's.
Yeah, absolutely.
So give us the abbreviated history on Little Al's.
Yeah, so Little Al's, as we now know it, was built by yet another German-born gentleman by the name of Johann or John Schick. In 1875. And it's interesting, the brick that he used, this was probably the first masonry building in Mokena, the first building to be built out of brick. But the bricks that he used to build this building also are local. They were baked in a kiln sort of alongside the Rock Island tracks that was off of Francis Road, or what today we would call Francis Road.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
And I know from your book, the old pictures show that there used to be stairs, right, that went down on the side of the stairs that go up into the bar now?
Yeah, exactly. The whole front of the building used to look pretty different because the ground there used to be a little higher than it is now. But if you look where there's the Marine Corps flag and there's the little sign that says Little Al's Bar and Grill, that right there used to be an entrance into the basement. And where there's this, where the POW flag is, there's that big white kind of board or whatever it is. That was an entrance that went upstairs for the days when the building was served as a hotel. Saloon slash hotel inn, what have you.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But the The building is it's very old. It's very, very historic. Was in the hands of the Sheik family for a pretty long time.
And Al, who has recently sold the property, was, I think, the second longest owner, or pretty close to it, if not the second longest owner in its lifetime.
Yeah, he would have been pretty close because he opened up in 85, I think, 1985. And he just sold, that was very recently. Let's see, who else? The Hirsch family, Frank Hirsch, ran a saloon here from about 1902 until World War II days.
Okay.
So that's 40-ish years. It's about the same as Al. The Mueller family was around a long time. They were there about 20 years. Right after World War II until about the mid-60s or so, when Mr. Mueller passed away in 1965. Yeah.
So, and I'll talk a little bit about this gravel lot that's here now.
Yeah.
When we came to town, it had the screen printer, the shirt maker was here.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of disappeared one day.
Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah, it was another historic landmark that went before its time. Unfortunately. But yeah, this building, so in our day, this was Carter Garretsy's silk screening workshop. But this building was originally built in 1902 as the Mokena post office. And as far as we can tell, this was the first building to be built to specifically serve as the post office. Because, of course, the Mokena post office has been around since 1853, but it kind of bounced around town based on whoever postmaster was, or whoever the postmaster was, and he would usually keep it in wherever his business was. So yeah, this building seems to have been the first one to have been built specifically for the usage of a post office. That was in 1902, and then
And that was the building that was here until a couple years ago?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. The post office moved from across the street from the Blazer building. That's the building on the corner. That's what they called it for years. Into this, and the post office was in this building for a very long time. And if you may remember, the building had two front doors. That's because there was, not for all of the building's history, but for a long time of its history, there were two businesses in there. It was usually the post office and a barber shop.
Okay.
On the other side. Various barbers over the years. One of the McGovneys was a barber here when the building was first built. George Krause was a barber later on. Andy Haar, who a lot of people will remember, was a barber there.
So continuing on this, which is really now parking lot.
Yeah.
What was here? What is this space?
Yeah, so where this parking lot is, kind of like right about here, was a pretty simple old building that was built towards the end of the 1800s. That for many, many years was a butcher shop.
Oh.
Erhard Oswald was a butcher here for many years. In the 20th century, World War I years, 1920s, thereabouts. He was an artist, as well as being a butcher. He would do his creations and hang them up in the butcher shop.
Wow.
Mr. Rinke, Paul Rinke, also kept his butcher shop here. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think that was before Mr. Oswald. And then later on, one of the last things, it was a fish market around not too long after World War II ended, and there were sort of like troughs of fish out front, live fish that you could go and, pick out your fish.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And the Mokena laundromat was in there. That was probably the last thing that was in there. And if I'm not mistaken, that was Mr. Mueller. This is embarrassing. I'm blanking on Mr. Mueller's first name, but his family's still around. But I'm pretty sure he was the one that had the building torn down, and he built a modern laundromat kind of where that grassy area is, right there in the 60s.
Let's talk about this building here.
Yeah.
Again, another Gino Picciola building.
Yeah.
But this has been around a long time as well, right?
It is, yeah. Another very, very historic building. Was built probably around 1870 or so by a man by the name of Valentin Scher, who, you guessed it, German-born, as was most of the population, or a fair amount of the population of Mokena in his day. And he was a harness maker by trade. So this is where he set up his shop. He made harnesses, repaired them, fixed them, stuff like that. He also sold trunks and valises, stuff like that. Pretty successful businessman. He was on the first board of trustees, village trustees, when the town was incorporated in 1880, and their very first village board meetings were held in this building.
Oh, very cool.
Right at incorporation.
And this building keeps the high sidewalk there, but was it in the 80s where they kind of lowered the streets or changed the grade of the roads? And that wasn't that more of the level?
Yeah.
Maybe you can explain it better, but of how high the sidewalks are here.
Yeah, it was, like you can see if you compare the entrances to Gino's building and Little L's, you can see that Little L's, like, there's more, you have to walk up more to get into it. And it was sort of leveled out. I'm pretty sure that was during the Mueller years over there. I think that would have been, and I actually talked to Rick Mueller about this, nice guy whose parents were the owners of the tavern here. I think that was maybe in the early 60s.
Okay.
That was kind of smoothened out. But this building actually, Gino's building now, has, there's been tons and tons of things in this over the years. People will remember it. People of a certain age, of which there's not too terribly many left, will remember it as the Sipple General Store. Then it was Irwin Howes was in there, had a Royal Blue store in there.
When would Royal Blue have been? What time frame?
I think Mr. Howes moved in with his Royal Blue. He had it at a different location down the street. If I'm not mistaken, he would have moved in maybe like late 30s, I want to say, but he eventually wound up being called to the Navy to fight in World War II, and the business just kind of went by the wayside. And it continued as a Royal Blue by the next owners, Joe and Vicky Grabarczyk, who came from Joliet, who are very well remembered in town to this day. They opened up, end of the 40s and were in business all the way up until the end of the 1970s.
Wow.
And kind of like an old-fashioned small-town grocery store.
And we'll wait till the car goes by so we don't get run over. But it is a really long building, and has a number of apartments upstairs too, right?
Oh, definitely.
Just don't realize, like, it's such a long building.
It is. It's pretty deep. It was added on to. This building used to actually look pretty different. When Mrs. Sipple, Kate Sipple, acquired this building out of her sister's estate in this was pretty far back, around 1911 or thereabouts. She added on to the back, onto the north.
Okay.
She chopped off a wing of the building that used to be on this side, this eastern side, and had it pushed back closer to First Street, and which could.
The front part here was pushed back, or
the wing that came off on this
I
side
see.
that she had removed, and it could possibly be this kind of grayish house that's back there. We don't know for sure. That building had at one point been kind of like a storehouse for the general store's goods.
Okay.
And there also was another one-story wing that came off on this western side of the building that she had demolished at that time. And this part that's there now where Lashology was built back on by the Grabarczyks in the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
And when the building was restored in the early 2000s, they kind of made it look like that original part that was demoed. But there was a really horrible fire in this building in 2002, and it was probably like borderline demo, unfortunately.
Wow.
But I'm so glad it was able to be saved. Unfortunately, the original stamped tin ceiling that used to be in this building was completely destroyed in the fire. as were the original floors. Or if they weren't original, they were at least very, very old. Luckily, I have pictures that I took myself of what it looked like before the fire, but yeah, it's still here, so that's what counts.
Yeah, very cool building.
Absolutely.
I always, this is such a curious little spot. Like, I feel like there should be something going on here.
Yeah,
a neat little garden area.
Yeah,
Neat to see the old, limestone, and you can almost tell the original brick, and then obviously they've had to do some patching in there. Over the years.
Yeah, around 1903 or so, 1902, 1903, the brick at the top of this building had to be sort of like redone because it was already caving in at that point.
Oh, wow.
For a building that was only 30-some years old at that point. But
and over the years, some of the other businesses have had some neat kind of like banner-ish signs and awnings, right, on this building?
On this building, yeah. There's been all kinds of really different signage over the years. It's the building, the exterior has changed a lot, but a lot of the original stuff does still remain, luckily.
And I think it's funny, and I just can't get past the little house. There's the painting. Something was painted on the side.
Yeah.
But nobody can.
It was some lettering that you can see very, very faintly on the side of the building. And you can make it out a lot better in old pictures, but there are no pictures that I've ever seen that actually show all of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just barely, I don't know if anything will show up, but.
Yeah, like I can see.
It's almost like an S?
An S right here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's neat.
But yeah, so it, there was something painted on the side, probably an ad or something, but.
And I shouldn't expect you, any idea if, I would assume this is maybe local stone, local limestone?
Or, probably from Joliet, or, because a lot of stone used to be quarried out of Joliet in the era this building was built.
Yeah.
Somewhere local, in any case,
cool.
I'm sure.
A lot of events at that place over the years.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I still laugh. The stories of was it the bird parties or the turkey?
The feather parties.
The feather parties.
Yeah. Yeah, those were a pretty big deal in the Mueller years.
That must have been something to see.
Yeah.
So this spot is another one we've talked a lot about here.
Yeah.
Former home of the Cooper Hostert Ford, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So go from there. Like what else has been on this site?
Yeah. So same thing. Multiple buildings have been here over the years, but the one that a lot of people will remember, the building that was there before this one, was originally built. Let's see. Wait for this train. Was originally built as the Mokena Hall in, I believe it was 1913 is when Mokena Hall opened up. It was built by Emil Kropp and George Hacker, two local businessmen. And it answered a big need because at the time there was no real central place for people to get together and people to have meetings or parties, or movies were just starting to come on to the scene at that time. So Mokena Hall was there, all the way up until about 1919 or so, when the building got completely refurbished into a car dealership. And that would have been the firm of Hench and Hench, who were two brothers. It was Fred, and what was Fred Hench's brother's name? Albert, maybe? In any case, and then it was Hench and Helmuth. They had a different partner. But Cooper and Hostert moved in. Elmer Cooper and Barney Hostert were on the scene here as early as 1916, when they opened up their Ford agency, dealer, repairing, stuff like that, in a little building that used to be just to the north of this, fronting on First Street. And then when Hench and Helmuth went under in the early 1920s, they just kind of moved into this building, where they were all the way up until the 1970s.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there's some really interesting pictures of the fire.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen that took this out, but
that was a bad
what do you know
fire.
about that?
The fire happened in the spring of 1993. I remember it. I was here. Fire departments from all over came to fight it. I remember you could see the plume of smoke from as far away as 191st Street, actually.
Wow.
But in any case, the company that was in here at that time was it Feld & Co. or Feldco? And they made things like parade floats and banners, flags, stuff like that. And there was a mishap involving one of the industrial dryers that they used, and that's what caused the fire, and it just got out of control so quick.
Wow.
And the firemen were able to put out the fire, but it just ravaged the whole building, and it was...
And how long did something move in here quickly after? Did it sit a while?
If I remember right, the 1913 building was torn down pretty quick after the fire, and then this building was built. And for a long time, where Avalanche Jewelry is now, the first thing to be in this building was a dance studio. There would be like dance classes and things like that held here. There were karate classes held here. And there was always something else like off to the side here, like where PKD Properties is and where Star Spangled Sales is. But yeah, like when I think about the early life of this building, I think about the dance studio. So yeah.
And this is, we had the Christmas story where we talked about, Santa Claus coming down and all the, that this was really a local kind of hangout, for a lot of people.
It was Cooper and Hoster, yeah.
Even Dave Bergman talked a lot about that too, how he started here and he spent, so much time here. So it's interesting that, just the pictures and the memories are left of that. But let's cross over and then talk about kind of the building that's behind us. Another one of the newer additions to Front Street.
Yeah, it's a newer one. I think it was built about 2007 or so, if I remember right. And same thing, you could say this for so many places on Front Street, but there's been numerous buildings on this spot since the founding of Mokena. The building that was here before this one was a much smaller, much simpler building that over the years had a million different restaurants in it, like takeout places, stuff like that. Interestingly, one of the places that sticks out in my mind the most, it was before my lifetime, but a figure that looms here for me is a gentleman by the name of Doc White, who also owned a restaurant, he and his wife. It was called the Le Petit Café, but everybody in town just called it Doc's. And Doc White was a very interesting man. If I'm not mistaken, I think he started here, and a lot of people mainly remember him being down in the building on the corner, though. He was there for a while, too, but he's a really interesting guy. He was must have been born about 1904 in the Ozarks in Arkansas. He and his family moved to Oklahoma when he was still a pretty little kid, in which it was basically still the Wild West. Like, they were concerned about the native tribes and stuff that were still there at the time when they moved there. And he came to Mokena in the 20s when he was, I'm not sure what the official title of this job is, but he was one of the guys that would string up telephone wires, and he was able to climb up a phone pole like in record time, just like right up to the top of it.
Wow.
And but yeah, he set down roots here, opened his restaurant in I think 58, and he always kind of wore a white t-shirt and his white apron, and he had a missing finger, and got his nickname Doc because when he was a kid, people would always ask him for cures for things. He said that he had a cure for everything. So Doc White was a really interesting guy. But yeah, he had a restaurant that was a well-known place. A lot of people will remember over the years.
So now this is a U-Haul parking lot, but this was this not part of the car dealership at the time? Or?
This didn't have anything to do with Cooper and Hostert.
Okay.
Years ago, Dave Bergman had a used car lot here. I mean, I even remember it from when I was growing up, but there were, same thing, multiple buildings. Going way, way back into the 1800s, Ducker's Mill was there. Unfortunately, I've never seen any photos of it, so I'm not sure really what kind of mill it was. If it was a grist mill or a sawmill or whatever kind of, but it was always referred to as Ducker's Mill. And it burnt down in a really horrible fire in 1903 when Clemens Oswald was running it. And after the fire, he rebuilt kind of a small little building, typical for its time. He ran pretty sure it was a grain office out of it. And then later on in the 20th century, for a while, it was an undertaker. That was Wunderlich and McGovney. They were the firm was from Joliet, and then they teamed up with one of the McGovneys. I can't remember if it was Ona McGovney or which one, but yeah, they had their undertaking there.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was another little building that used to be here, long gone, of course.
And of course, this was not too long ago. Was Dena's barber, not salon, barber shop.
Right.
And now it's an empty lot.
Unfortunately,
Talk a little bit about what all has been on this site.
Yeah, there's been a lot of stuff here. Basically, where this entire empty space is, at one point had been home to 3 different buildings. There were, let's see, starting off on this side by the alleyway here, was a commercial building, kind of like a building with a big false front, kind of like you'd see from the 19th century. The beginnings of it are not too terribly in focus, but by the 1890s, James Ducker Jr. was running a store here. He got his safe blown up in the 1890s in the middle of the night, got some stuff stolen. And the building next to it was a very, very old house. Easily one of the oldest in the village, easily pre-Civil War. It did have a little space on the first floor for commercial stuff. Like I think there had been a shoemaker in there at one point. But the building's main claim to fame was that they came both to be under the ownership of the Stellwagen family, and by Philip Stellwagen, and eventually onto his children. And the Stellwagen family didn't take the awesomest care of their property. Eventually, by the 1900s, they had moved away, and the places just started falling apart. They were totally decrepit for decades, and local kids even called them the haunted houses.
Oh, wow.
Because that's what they looked like. The building that was over here, the village finally got it torn down in the 50s, towards the end of the 1950s, and the older house that would have been right next to the barbershop burnt down actually in the 60s. That's what happened to those.
Oh, wow.
But there was, of course, we remember that Tony Dena Jr. and Sr., his father, their barbershop was here. But before that was a much older building that was built in Civil War. That was John Schubert's hardware store and implement store. He's a big figure in the early history of Mokena. I think he was a police magistrate at one point. He's a name you encounter a lot when you dive back into the years. And the building, that original building, burnt down in 1927, which was after Deputy Fisher, Walter Fisher, had his store in there, who our listeners will know him.
Sure.
Yeah, he had his business there. Before Deputy Fisher, it was the Niethammer hardware store. Before that, it was the Zahn hardware store. Mostly hardware stores over the years.
Interesting.
But yeah, Deputy Fisher had his general store here too, until the fire took it out.
And when was Tony Dena's salon built? Salon. I keep calling it a salon. The barber shop.
Yeah. No, yeah. His the barber shop was built by Tony Dena Sr. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was in that same post-war era. Because you've probably noticed I keep talking about like, oh, this was not too long after World War II. Those first post-war years in Mokena were very booming, and there was lots of stuff going on, construction-wise and business-wise and things like this. But yeah, that was, I wish I could remember the exact year, but it was not long after World War II ended. And when they built it, Mr. Dena planned to have his barber shop in one side of it, and then he kind of had another space. It had two front doors, kind of like the old post office. One would go to the barber shop, and then the next one into what would have hypothetically been another business. But they could never really get anybody to get in there. And eventually, in my day, that was Tony Dena Jr.'s expanded waiting room for his customers on that other side. But it's interesting, as the story goes, Tony Dena Sr.'s first customer was one of the men who built the building, and it wasn't even finished yet. He gave him his haircut while he was sitting on a sawhorse.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So there's
very cool. It's a cool old site. You know, see the pictures of it, the old warehouse that was here before Dena's, and you know, it's just, it would have been so cool to see what that felt like on the street here.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's
and a huge site. I mean, it feels like such a big property here.
It is, yeah. It really is. I really wonder what's gonna come of this.
Yeah, hopefully something else to help build up downtown here.
Yeah, right.
So across,
Absolutely.
This was Big Jim's at one time?
That was
Pizza?
Big Jim's Pizza, yep, operated by Jim Schlegel. I can't remember the gentleman's name that was before Big Jim. There was if I'm not mistaken, the man who founded it was another Jim. But anyway, eventually Jim Schlegel took over. That was in the 70s, going into the 80s. But this is a pretty historic building. I don't think it's quite as old as the Civil War, but not very far from it.
We got a picture of Jim Schlegel right up in front of it, too.
Oh, yeah, that's
How
him,
about that?
That's definitely
and that
him.
Was quite, what, 80s? Into the 80s?
Yeah, I think the pizza place went into the 80s, yeah.
And
definitely.
Other than that and the groomer, what has this property been? This is a really old building, as you said.
It is. It's very, very old. 1800s easily. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. There was a saloon here in the 19th century. One of the 7 or 8 that Mokena had. There was also a butcher shop. Paul Rinke, who would later move down the street a little bit, but he opened up here in the first years of the 20th century. Had his business going here for a long time. There's a really cool picture of him that the Rinke family has to this day. He's standing in his shop with his saws and stuff all hanging up, and the counter, really ornately carved wooden counter in front of him with these like bloody cuts of meat all over it, and he's wearing his apron and he has a big handlebar mustache. I'm not sure if that was taken in this building or his other location he was in further down the street, but
okay.
I think I had that picture in my first book.
That's very cool.
But it's a cool one, yeah.
All right, well, probably one of my favorites, Laura's salon here.
Yeah, absolutely, very historic.
So we'll go get a closer look because she does such a great job in her gardens. But
yeah,
talk a little bit about this building.
Yeah, so there's a lot of history here too. This is one of the oldest buildings in Mokena. It was already here in 1862, so a year into the Civil War. It was probably already a few years old by that point. The first owners of this property, at least of the lot, after Alan Denny subdivided Mokena, were the Carpenters, who Carpenter Street is named after. There was Horace Carpenter and Chauncey Carpenter. They were guys who, it seems like they did a lot of investing in property because they were buying up lots in Mokena like crazy in those years leading up to the Civil War. One of them had been in California during one of the gold rushes out there. And actually struck gold, and was known to wear was known to wear a gold nugget as a tie pin. It's pretty interesting. So whether one of them actually built this house, I don't know, but it definitely existed when they did. And
Yes.
another early owner of the property during the Civil War years was Dr. Andreas Grader, who was a Swiss-born doctor who was one of the founders of St. John's Church.
Oh, wow.
Did a lot of work healing the residents of Mokena in those days. Lost his son in the Civil War. Whether the son lived here, that I don't know. But Dr. Grader is a big figure in the history. But a lot of people, especially as I always say, those people of a certain age, of whom there really aren't too terribly many left anymore.
Yeah.
Will remember this being the residence of the Moriarty sisters, Lizzie and Sadie Moriarty, who were both born Fultons. They were Fultons, and they grew up out in New Lenox Township, but they married two brothers from the Moriarty family, and eventually the brothers were successful farmers, but they moved here, and the two sisters, once they were widows, lived here for a very long time. Let's see, there was Lizzie Moriarty, or a lot of people called her Aunt Lizzie. She was born about 1863, and they moved here or at least she and her husband did, about 1914. And she died in the 1950s, but she lived here the whole time.
And there's a neat picture of her, I think, right on the front porch here.
Yeah. She was kind of like a fixture on the porch, working on like sewing rags and quilts and stuff like that. And a lot of the local kids knew her and would come visit her when they were out and about and stuff like that.
And there is another picture I think you have in your book of somebody leaning against the pillar here.
Oh, yeah.
I know you said in another episode who that was.
Yeah, if I'm thinking of the same picture, that would have been Colonel Charles Moriarty, who was Aunt Lizzie's brother-in-law.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure if he ever actually lived here or not, or maybe he was just visiting when they took that picture. But yeah, he's standing right out here, right out front.
Yeah, very cool.
Another interesting figure in Mokena's history, but...
and the pillars, I believe they're original to the building, right?
Yeah, they are. Laura Teal, the current owner, has fixed them up a lot. So there's like mixtures of original and restoration here. But these are pretty old. They've been here they date from right around the time the Moriartys moved in. And have been here ever since. There used to be a matching concrete railing that went around too, which unfortunately is
and Laura said too, because that's where the picture of Lizzie Moriarty was sitting in the corner there. So I had asked her, because there was kind of a wall there when she did, but to get the access for the business, I think they had to do the ramp down there on the side. To take it out.
Sure.
But, yeah, very cool. And
there's a lot
they do such a great job to keep this place up and do nice landscaping here.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's one of the highlights of Front Street, I think.
Yeah, and again, we've said it before, but major props to Laura for keeping this up and doing work to remodel this property and keep it beautiful.
She really is. She doesn't get nearly as much credit as I think she deserves, because she, in my mind, is kind of like an unsung hero in Mokena's history, because when she acquired this property over 20 years ago now, I think, it was borderline demolition. It was in bad shape. Oh. But she put tons of work into sprucing this place back up and making sure we didn't lose it. And because of that, we have one of Mokena's oldest houses. It's still here.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Ready to go for another 100 years. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, the rest of this, a lot of these are, again, kind of newer buildings.
Yeah.
But anything significant? I know we have where the insurance house is. Another building, but talk about this space too a little bit.
Yeah, this building isn't too terribly old. I think it only dates from around the early 1980s or so, which in Mokena is like just yesterday. But when I was growing up, there was always Villa Pizza here, where the salon is now. big time place for a lot of people to go, like on Friday night and get pizza and stuff like that. Was here for years. Good place. Still, I miss it. And the corner here, as you mentioned, where the insurance house is, same thing. This building's not too terribly old. It's roughly the same age as this one here, but going way back into the 19th century, this was the site of the Schubert Saloon. Nicholas Schubert, who was the brother of John Schubert, the hardware man from a few doors that way. Another one of our German guys, he would have the Männerchor come practice here, which is like a German choir of singing men. Oh, okay. They would practice here, and he was in business from easily end of the 1860s up into the 1890s when he died. Wow. Various saloons and stores were here. In the 20s, the two brothers of Milton and Roy Kropp acquired the property and really rehabbed and expanded it. They made the building twice as big.
Wow.
When they were done with it. And they had the Mokena Hardware Company in here for a while, and then Milton bought out his brother's interest. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, Milton Kropp sold out his interest to a gentleman from Frankfurt around the Depression years. But one of their improvements to this building was they built, well, not this building, but the one that was here before it, was they built a little wing off to the side that held the post office for a while.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it shows you just what kind of small rural town Mokena was in those days, because it was really tiny. It was just a tiny little wing of this building. But in the days after World War II, Mr. Dunham opened up his hardware store here, and a lot of people are around who remember him. Pretty big hardware store, excuse me, an old-time hardware store, but he kind of, as he got older, a lot of people, you can ask anybody that shopped there, and they'll tell you the same story. You would go in and you would ask, like, I'm looking for a such and such. He would always say, oh, I just sold the last one, or, oh, it'll be here on Tuesday, or something like that. So, yeah, he was more interested in other things.
And talk about the footprint, because this was a building, the hardware store, that sat like right up on the sidewalk, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
And how far back would it have kind of been to where we see the fence back there, or how big of a building was it? Do you know?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it was, especially after the Kropps expanded the building, it was easily that big.
And speaking of the Kropps, the house that sits behind.
Oh yeah, that's
talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So what had happened was the once again the Kropp brothers, they acquired this property here on the corner and the next one north on the corner of 1st and Division Street. This is like early 20s, and roughly around the same time they expanded the building that became the hardware store here, they bought the original St. John's Church, which was over on 2nd Street, and moved it to the corner of 1st and Division, where it still stands today, and they converted it into a residential space. And
it's such and you wrote a great piece in the Mokena Messenger. Thanks. I remember that the first time reading that.
Yeah.
But even till more recently, you look at the front, it's just a beautiful 2-story building with a beautiful front porch.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you look on the side angle, you can see that it was a church. Like you can see that more of the frame of a church.
I was actually lucky enough to be in this house years and years ago. And even in the inside, you could tell even more, because the ceilings up on the 2nd floor have kind of like a curve to them, like you would see in an old church.
Yeah.
So that's a landmark that's been in Mokena since 1862. That's still standing.
Yeah, very cool.
Been moved, but it's still original. So.
And even the story of how they moved it, rolling it on logs, right, from St. John's.
Yeah.
Really
they probably would have used. We know what happened when they moved it, but None of the newspaper coverage talks about whether they had teams of horses that were doing it, or if they were using trucks, or both, or what. But yeah, I mean, moving moving buildings around was something that was super common in the days of our forefathers, that I wish people still did today, because it's a lot more resourceful than just tearing buildings down when you don't want them anymore. So
it is cool how many buildings, you know, that happen. Like we talk about where Zap is, you know, and this, it's like, you know, shuffling properties around town.
Totally.
It's pretty cool.
Totally.
I've never known anything about this property here.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this one?
Yeah, so this building, not a huge amount of detail has survived over the years, but the original portion of it is this part here off to the left, where there's the two windows and then the one window in the second story, and there's like this arbor or whatever it is. That's the oldest part of this building, and it was just a residential house.
Wow, so this little thing on the corner here was the whole house at one point.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's pretty old, definitely 19th century. I'm guessing it's probably post-Civil War, but it's definitely very old. Around the turn of the 20th century, there was a family that owned this property, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing their last name properly, but it's like Leonhardt, or something like that. And the family patriarch was a shoemaker. And I was told by a Mokenian that I know that years back, you know, in the past, but not in the distant past, somebody had opened up a wall in this house and found a leather child's shoe. So that's, I like to think that was from when they were here in the property, but eventually over the years it got added onto and kind of built out.
And this property sits, I mean, there's not too many houses that sit much closer to the tracks than this one here.
Yeah, no, not too many.
And this little park here.
Yeah.
What do you know about this?
This was kind of built up here in the, what did they even call it? Back in the, there are a million people in Mokena who will know this and could correct me, but in the late 90s, the village at the time went out on a project to kind of refurbish Front Street a little bit. And this is when this was built, along with the seating area over closer to the railroad depot on the north side of the tracks. So this is like roughly around, when this dates from too.
And was this any historic sites that sat here, or any properties that you know of?
Not that I know of, but that absolutely does not mean that nothing was here. There was a building that stood closer to where this pharmacy is nowadays, more in this footprint. And it was owned by a local man in the early 1900s by the name of Simon Hohenstein, who sold implements and carriages and stuff like that. So he had them all here in his building here. And then later on, that building got converted into residential, and much later, a local gentleman by the name of Tuffy Hummerding lived there. That's going pretty far into the 20th century, though.
So, last thing, and maybe we'll touch on it a little bit more, but this is a house I walk by, frequently. Yeah. Obviously, a very old and very small house.
Yeah.
What do you know about this place?
Oh yeah, it's another one steeped in history. This was originally, once again, as far back as I can tell, there's probably history from that I've never been able to unearth on it, but right around the 1870s, this was acquired by Michael and Louisa Enders. And whether or not they built it or if it was already here when they got it, it's kind of a mystery. Something stood on this lot in 1862, but whether it was that house, which is entirely possible, I don't know though. But they made their home here for basically the rest of the 19th century, and the aforesaid Simon Hohenstein, who had his implement / carriage, what have you, little showroom here, acquired the property towards the end of the 1890s. Well, no, excuse me, more around the 1905 or so. And then the Hohensteins lived here for a very long time. In fact, there's kind of a funny, well, it's not funny, but an interesting story that puts life in Mokena into perspective. Around it must have been, it wasn't too terribly long before World War I started, so in that time frame, a fire broke out on the McGovney farm, which is now we know as the Junker farm. One of the outbuildings caught on fire, and Mr. Hohenstein's son saw it from their house. So that gives you an idea of how, this wasn't grown up. You could see straight across the railroad over to the McGovney farm at that time, and he was the one who sounded the alarm because he happened to see it in the middle of the night.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and when the trees aren't here, and you can see right through there and see the red barn now, but
oh yeah, definitely.
That's a really cool story. Gives you an idea of, like you said, a good picture of those times.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, there's so much more we've got to talk about down that way,
definitely.
from where the old calaboose sat to the first mayor of Mokena's house, where the old school sat.
Oh, definitely.
So we're gonna have to do a couple more of these, Matt.
I think so. Yeah, I'm ready.
But it's great to get a picture and kind of put in place a lot of these stories that we've been talking about now for a while.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really cool to be here on Front Street and to think of the history and to kind of soak it all in the place where it happened.
Yeah, and to think about the idea of, now if somebody needs something, we're running to Meyer or to Burkhart's or whatever it is, but Front Street here was where everybody got what you needed. Everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's hard, I think, for people now even to understand that because it's not something we're used to.
Right, I know.
You either go online or you run to the big grocery store.
Yeah. It was a completely different way of life. And if we came to see Mokena 100 years ago, or not even that long ago, it would have looked completely different. There were a lot more buildings. If you couldn't get it here, you probably didn't need it, at least not urgently.
And if you did, you'd have to wait till they shipped it or mailed it or came on the train, right?
Oh, totally, absolutely, yeah.
And even the idea of owls, there's so many people in town, say they don't or wouldn't go in, but that bar in its day wasn't just a bar, it was a community center. It was like we talked about the feather parties. And,
right.
It was a different thing than it is now.
It is, it was much different. The lifestyle that our forefathers led, was just profoundly different from ours. I wish I could go back. I wouldn't, let me go into a little more detail on that. I would love to go back, but I wouldn't want to go back and stay because I am too much a product of my time.
Sure.
And I am totally spoiled by the conveniences that we now have, like indoor plumbing and hot water.
Concrete sidewalks.
Yeah, concrete. Yeah, they used to be made out of wood and were dangerous. But I would love to go back, if I could go on like a trip for like a month or something back to experience what life was like back then. Yeah.
And I mean, the simplest things now would have been huge challenges at the time.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. I was, reading some of the newspapers and thinking about, talking about the library.
Oh,
and, now kids are spoiled with a huge library with computers and everything you can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, when it started, the Lions helped pay the rent.
They did.
And the Lions were buying books for it. And, it was a community get-together, or, a thing that the community put together.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't an expected thing given by the village or the government.
Definitely not, yeah. Yeah, it was a lot of local people and organizations that chipped in just to make that happen. Yeah. But that was a story for so many things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as is fitting, the train's coming through.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So again, Matt, this is a great tour. Good to
Thanks, Israel.
get a lot of the history and put some things in context.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks for having me.
Thanks as always. Great.
Oh, you're
great
welcome.
walk.
Can't wait to do it again.